Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to the summer of 1916, to the fields of northern France where the river Somme winds its quiet way through countryside that would soon witness one of history's great battles. This is a story of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, told through the eyes of those who were there, preserved in their letters, diaries, and memories. In the late spring of 1916, Private Arthur Edward Diggins of the Royal Engineers found himself in a world transformed by war. The young man from Leicestershire had arrived in France in February, carrying his pencil and a small diary that would become his constant companion. Around him, the countryside of Picardy stretched endlessly rolling hills and quiet villages that seemed almost peaceful in the morning light. Arthur was not alone in his arrival. Across the front lines, thousands of men were gathering. The British Fourth Army, commanded by General Sir Henry Rawlinson, was preparing for what would become known as the Big Push. These were not the regular soldiers of the old British Army. Most were volunteers, men who had answered Kitchener's call in 1914 and 1915, miners from Wales, clerks from London, farmers from Yorkshire. They called them PALS battalions because entire communities had enlisted together, believing they would fight together, live together, and return home together. Harry Drinkwater, a 25-year-old shop assistant from Stratford-upon-Avon, was among these volunteers. He had been assigned to what they called a PALS battalion, men who knew each other from civilian life, who had worked side by side in shops and factories before they found themselves training to work side by side in trenches. Harry, like so many others, had thought the war would be over quickly. It was now 1916, and that optimism had long since faded into a grim determination. Harry Drinkwater, a 25-year-old shop assistant from Stratford-upon-Avon, was among these volunteers. He had been assigned to what they called a PALS battalion, men who knew each other from civilian life, who had worked side by side in shops and factories before they found themselves training to work side by side in trenches. Harry, like so many others, had thought the war would be over quickly. It was now 1916, and that optimism had long since faded into a grim determination. The preparation was methodical and thorough. Lieutenant B.L. Lawrence, walking through what had recently been no man's land near St. Pierre Vast Wood, noted the strange silence that had fallen over the front. We found that our line consisted of a number of outpost positions formed by hastily dug bits of trench near the far edge of the wood, he would later write. There was absolute silence, just as if the war had suddenly stopped, and all the country looked deserted and neglected, as if no human being had been near it for years. Preparation was methodical and thorough. Lieutenant B.L. Lawrence, walking through what had recently been no man's land near St. Pierre Vast Wood, noted the strange silence that had fallen over the front. We found that our line consisted of a number of outpost positions formed by hastily dug bits of trench near the far edge of the wood, he would later write. There was absolute silence, just as if the war had suddenly stopped and all the country looked deserted and neglected, as if no human being had been near it for years. Yet beneath this deceptive calm, both sides were preparing. The Germans, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had spent months constructing elaborate defensive positions. They had learned from earlier battles. Their trenches were not simple ditches, but complex networks of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and underground shelters that could withstand even the heaviest artillery bombardment. The British artillery began its preliminary bombardment on June 24, 1916. For 7 days and nights, the guns never stopped. The sound could be heard in London, 150 miles away. Over 1 million shells were fired along a front 20 miles long. The soldiers waiting in the trenches felt the ground shake beneath their feet with each explosion. Private R. Mason, crouched in his frontline trench, later recalled the morning of July 1st. At 5.3, the barrage came down. It consisted of light artillery on the front line coupled with light howitzers. 300 yards beyond that came down the heavier natures. The plan seemed simple enough. The massive bombardment would destroy the German wire, collapse their trenches, and demoralize the defenders. Then at 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, the infantry would walk not run, but walk across no man's land and occupy the empty German trenches. Some officers were so confident that they brought walking sticks rather than rifles. The cavalry waited behind the lines, ready to exploit the breakthrough. As June turned to July, the men wrote their letters home. Arthur Diggins penciled his thoughts in his small diary. Harry Drinkwater prepared for what he hoped would be his first and last major battle. In quiet moments between the endless artillery barrages, they played cards, shared cigarettes, and tried not to think about what morning would bring. The bombardment lifted just before dawn on July 1st, 1916. In the sudden, shocking silence that followed, 60,000 British soldiers prepared to leave their trenches. They had been told it would be easy. They had been told the Germans would be too shattered to resist. They had been told that by evening they would be miles behind enemy lines. What they found instead would become the bloodiest day in British military history. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the battlefield, Arthur Wagger of the 56th London Division found himself near the village of Gaumecourt. The young soldier, along with thousands of his comrades, had spent the long night in crowded trenches, listening to the endless thunder of artillery and trying to steel himself for what was to come. Around him, the whispered conversations of nervous men created a low murmur that mixed with the distant sound of shells. At exactly 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along the British line. The sound was thin and brave in the morning air, almost lost beneath the renewed crash of supporting artillery. Company Sergeant Major sitting on the parapet began yelling, "Come on, boys, over the top, over the top." Arthur and his companions climbed the wooden ladders that had been placed along the trench walls and emerged into a world transformed. The landscape that greeted them bore no resemblance to the peaceful farmland this had once been. No man's land stretched before them, a wasteland of shell holes, broken wire, and churned earth. The week-long bombardment had created a moonscape of craters, some large enough to swallow an entire squad of men. The morning mist hung low over this desolation, giving it an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. But as Arthur and his companions began their advance, they quickly realized that their carefully laid plans were falling apart. The German defenses, rather than being destroyed, had largely survived the bombardment. Deep underground bunkers had protected the machine gun crews, who now emerged from their shelters to find thousands of British soldiers advancing in neat lines across open ground. Arthur would later remember, as soon as we got the instructions to jump over the top we went, and our company sergeant major was sitting on the parapet and yelling to the boys. There, as I came up into the trench, I could see 2 or 3 fellas, including 2 brothers who were lying dead. They had been killed, of course, by the German gunfire. Then we looked along the line, and we realized there were very few of us left. Further south, in what would become known as the Sausage Valley, the Lonsdale Battalion prepared to advance toward a German strongpoint called Muck Farm. 22-year-old Fred Francis was among the men waiting in the wood for the signal to attack. When 0 hour came and they filed out of the protective trees, they found themselves completely exposed. At 0 hour, when we filed out of this wood, the colonel patted me on the back, said, "Good luck, son," but we were literally sitting ducks. They just mowed us down like grass. The German machine gunners, positioned in concrete pillboxes and fortified positions, had clear fields of fire across no man's land. The British advance, conducted at walking pace to maintain formation, presented perfect targets. Private Alex Thompson, attacking near Hill 60 at Ypres, later described the experience. "We advanced maybe 5 or 10 yards, but some of them never got that length. They were killed going over the trench." The rattle of machine gun fire mixed with the crash of artillery created what survivors would remember as an almost physical wall of sound and steel. Yet not all of the attack failed. In the south, where the French were fighting alongside the British, the assault achieved many of its objectives. The 30th Division captured the village of Montauban on schedule. XIII Corps, advancing methodically behind a creeping barrage, took all of its assigned targets. Here, the German defenses were less developed, and the coordination between artillery and infantry worked as planned. George, serving with the 7th Battalion Royal West Kent Regiment as part of the 18th Division, found himself in one of these more successful sectors. His unit had spent almost a year facing the German lines southwest of Montauban, studying every detail of the enemy positions. When they advanced on July 1st, they knew exactly where they were going. Company A maintained its position in the newly captured German front line, though the cost was heavy. They would suffer 180 casualties before being relieved 4 days late. Private Arthur Edward Diggins, with his pencil and diary, found himself in the midst of chaos that defied description. In his small, careful handwriting, he would later record, "Something awful, never witnessed anything like it before." After a bombardment of a week, the Germans mounted their own trenches, and the infantry reckoned that every German had a machine gun. Our fellows were mowed down. The tragedy was not just in the scale of the casualties, but in their concentration. Entire communities were decimated in minutes. The Accrington Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Grimsby Chums, these units, drawn from single towns and cities, suffered losses that would scar their home communities for generations. In Accrington, hardly a street was left untouched by grief. In Sheffield, the local newspaper would print column after column of casualty lists. By 8:30 a.m., just 1 hour after the attack began, it was clear that the northern half of the offensive had failed catastrophically. The German second line remained intact, the wire had not been cut, and thousands of British soldiers lay dead or wounded in no man's land. Yet the attack continued. Orders had been given, and the military machine, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. As the morning progressed into afternoon, rescue parties began the dangerous work of retrieving the wounded from no man's land. Private Dave Forrest, serving as a runner with the 141st Infantry, had 15 minutes to deliver a crucial message about the attack. He ran a quarter of a mile through enemies' bursting shells, but when he returned to his unit, he found they had already begun their advance. The chaos of battle had scattered careful plans like leaves in a storm. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the battlefield. The wounded called out for water, for help, for their mothers. Many lay where they had fallen, trapped in the wire or sheltering in shell holes, waiting for darkness to bring the stretcher bearers. The German snipers, positioned in their undamaged trenches, picked off anyone who moved. As evening approached on July 1st, 1916, the cost of the day began to become clear. Of the 60,000 British soldiers who had left their trenches that morning, nearly 57,000 had become casualties. Almost 20,000 would never see another sunrise. It was, and remains, the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. Yet the battle was far from over. The Somme offensive would continue for 4 more months, grinding through autumn and into winter. The names of small French villages, Thiepval, Pozières, Delville Wood, Flers-Courcelette, would be etched into memory alongside July 1st, 1916. In the days following the catastrophic first day of the Somme, the nature of the battle changed. The grand plans for breakthrough and rapid advance gave way to a grinding war of attrition, fought yard by yard through a landscape that grew more desolate with each passing day. Private Arthur Edward Diggins, his pencil diary now stained with mud and worse things, continued to record his observations of this transformed world. The trenches that became home to hundreds of thousands of men bore little resemblance to the neat diagrams in military textbooks. Rifleman William Eve of the Queen's Westminster Rifles, writing in his pocket diary during the harsh winter of 1914-1915, had described the reality. Went for shot to our trenches at rear, nothing particular doing. One of our chaps hit by sniper, the bullet just grazed the top of his head. By 1916, the trench systems had evolved into vast underground cities that stretched for hundreds of miles across the Western Front. A typical trench was about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide, dug in a zigzag pattern to prevent enemy soldiers from firing straight down its length. Wooden planks called duckboards lined the bottom to keep men's feet out of the water that inevitably collected. Sandbags stacked along the parapet provided some protection from sniper fire, while fire steps cut into the forward wall allowed soldiers to stand and shoot over the top. But these technical details failed to capture the lived experience of trench warfare. Harry Drinkwater, the shop assistant from Stratford-upon-Avon, found himself confronting conditions that no civilian life could have prepared him for. The constant dampness led to a condition the medical officers called trench foot, a fungal infection that could become so severe that amputation was the only treatment. The rats that infested the trenches grew fat on rations and human remains. In the night we have heaps of company, rats and mice and the other livestock, wrote one soldier to his family. Every time you wake, the rats are fighting and squeaking all over you. The psychological impact was perhaps even more challenging than the physical conditions. Sergeant Horace Reginald Stanley, fighting in the battles of Ypres and the Somme, had witnessed his brother killed when a shell hit their dugout at Arras. In his diary he wrote with stark honesty, "Could we return to the happy days of 1914, things can never be the same again. My brother is dead. I expected this, but my poor mother will never be the same again." The daily routine in the trenches followed a pattern that remained remarkably consistent throughout the war. Stand to came before dawn, when all men were required to man the fire step and watch for enemy attack in the weak light. After the morning stand to, there was weapon cleaning, equipment maintenance, and the endless work of trench repair. Sniper fire and artillery bombardment constantly damaged the elaborate earthworks, requiring immediate attention. Private John Pritchard Sudbury, who would later be wounded at Passchendaele, described the constant tension of life under fire. "The German Minenwerfers are terrible things. You hear a slight pop and then see the bally thing coming over. It is very hard to judge where they will fall, so you are kept in suspense with your eyes protruding out of your head watching the torpedo till it hisses down." These trench mortars lobbing high explosive shells in high arcs were particularly feared because their slow flight made them visible but gave little time to take cover. Communication in the trenches depended on an elaborate network of runners, telephone lines, and signal lamps. Private Dave Forrest had served as a runner, carrying messages between units under constant artillery fire. The telephone lines, strung along trench walls or buried underground, were frequently cut by shell fire, making human messengers essential despite the extreme danger. Food in the trenches was a constant concern. Hot meals were prepared in kitchens well behind the lines and carried forward in large metal containers called dixies. By the time the food reached the frontline troops, it was usually cold and often contaminated with mud or worse. The standard British ration included tinned beef, hard biscuits, jam, and tea. When supply lines were disrupted, men might go days with only emergency iron rations, hard biscuits, and tinned meat that required strong teeth and stronger stomachs. Lieutenant Alfred Forbes Johnson of the Royal Garrison Artillery maintained a regular correspondence with his wife Essie throughout his service. His letters provide a glimpse into how educated, thoughtful men coped with the daily stress of trench warfare. Johnson's philosophy, as recorded by those who knew him, was to spend life productively regardless of circumstances, maintaining good humor even in the most trying situations. The nights brought different challenges. Patrol duty required men to crawl out into no man's land to repair wire, gather intelligence, or attempt raids on enemy positions. These nocturnal expeditions were conducted in complete darkness, with men navigating by compass and counting their paces to avoid getting lost in the shell-cratered wasteland between the lines. Private William Eve recorded a typical night patrol in January 1915, guard 3.15515, and then another half-hour 10.151045. Paraded at 4.45, moved to trenches at 5 p.m. Got told off with 6 others, including George, for delving trench, had to go through sewer. Got jolly wet as usual. The medical care available in the trenches was basic, but often heroic. Stretcher bearers like William Collins of the Royal Army Medical Corps worked under constant fire to evacuate the wounded. Collins remembered his first experience with enemy artillery. In that wood, to the entrance to that wood, I heard the first shell burst above my head. It was a shrapnel shell with a high-ish burst, white smoke, and the bullets came down whistling like all the hobs of hell. First aid posts were established in the deepest, most protected parts of the trench system. Here, medical officers performed emergency surgery by candlelight, often without anesthetics when supplies ran short. During the Battle of Verdun, one French surgeon reported that anesthetics had run out due to the impossibility of bringing fresh supplies through the bombardment. Arms, even legs, were amputated without a groan, and even afterward the men seemed not to have felt the shock. They asked for a cigarette or inquired how the battle was going. The psychological toll of prolonged trench warfare manifested in various ways. Some men developed what was then called shell shock, a condition that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included uncontrollable shaking, nightmares, and an inability to function in combat situations. The military medical establishment was only beginning to understand these psychological wounds, and treatment was often harsh or non-existent. Yet alongside the horror and degradation, the trenches also fostered remarkable bonds of friendship and mutual support. The anonymous British soldier whose diary was found and auctioned at Bellman's had served with the 3rd Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers during 1914 and 1915. His account reveals the complex relationship that could develop between opposing forces. During the famous Christmas truce of 1914, British and German soldiers met in no man's land for a friendly game of football. Afterward, they worked out a system of mutual warning when attacks were planned. General HQ would be pretty sick if they knew this, the diarist noted. This humanity in the midst of mechanized warfare extended to caring for enemy wounded. When German soldiers were injured and British troops were unable to reach them, the same diarist lamented the fact that the soldier had to die a slow and inhumane death. Such moments of compassion provided psychological relief from the relentless dehumanization of industrial warfare. The rotation system meant that most soldiers spent only a few days at a time in the frontline trenches before being moved to support positions or rest areas behind the lines. This cycle, frontline, support, reserve, rest, was designed to prevent complete psychological breakdown from prolonged exposure to combat stress. Even so, many men found that the anticipation of returning to the front line was almost as difficult as being there. Mail from home provided a crucial psychological lifeline. Lieutenant Johnson's daily letters to his wife, Essie, allowed him to maintain connection with the world beyond the trenches. Family photographs, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp, were treasured possessions. Many soldiers wrote detailed letters home, though military censorship meant that explicit descriptions of combat were forbidden. As summer turned to autumn in 1916, the Battle of the Somme continued its grinding course. Villages that had been objectives for the first day's attack, Thiepval, Pozières, Guillemont, were finally captured after weeks of fighting. Each success was measured in yards and paid for with thousands of casualties. The initial hope for breakthrough had long since faded into a determination simply to hold ground and inflict more damage on the enemy than they inflicted in return. Private Arthur Edward Diggins continued filling his small diary until October 11, 1916, when his entries abruptly ceased. Whether this silence marked his death, serious injury, or simply the end of his diary, we do not know. His penciled words remain as testimony to the experience of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to have abandoned sense entirely. While the British prepared for their assault on the Somme, 150 miles to the southeast, another battle raged that would define the character of the entire war. The Battle of Verdun, which began on February 21, 1916 and continued until December 18, was a deliberate German attempt to bleed France white. The strategy was simple in its brutality. Attack a position the French could not afford to abandon, then methodically destroy every man they sent to defend it. The fortress city of Verdun held deep symbolic meaning for France. It guarded the traditional invasion route into the heart of the country and had been fortified for centuries. The Germans, under Crown Prince Wilhelm and his chief of staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, calculated that French national pride would compel them to hold Verdun at any cost. What they perhaps did not anticipate was the cost to their own forces in the long, grinding battle that followed. The German assault began with a bombardment of unprecedented intensity. For 10 hours on February 21st, 808 guns fired approximately 1 million shells along a front 30 kilometers long. The barrage was so intense it could be heard 160 kilometers away. Among the German artillery were 26 super-heavy guns, including 420 mortars that fired shells weighing nearly a ton. The opening phase of the attack fell primarily on French positions on the east bank of the Meuse River. Here, the fortress system included the famous forts of Douaumont and Vaux, massive concrete and steel structures that the French believed were impregnable. The German bombardment, however, revealed the limitations of pre-war military thinking. The fortresses, designed to withstand the artillery of the 1890s, were vulnerable to the massive shells of 1916. A French officer whose account survives in the archives described the scene at Fort Douaumont during the height of the battle. Verdun has become a battle of madmen in the midst of a volcano. Whole regiments melt in a few minutes, and others take their places only to perish in the same way. Between May 10th and May 23rd alone, the French estimated that the Germans expended 100,000 men on the west bank of the Meuse. The nature of the fighting at Verdun differed significantly from the trench warfare that characterized most of the Western Front. Here, the battle centered on fortified positions, underground tunnels, and the systematic destruction of every building, every tree, every landmark. The landscape became so completely obliterated that survivors had difficulty recognizing terrain they had known intimately before the battle. The psychological impact on the soldiers who fought at Verdun was particularly severe. A French surgeon working in a frontline aid post reported that in one redoubt of 200 French casualties, more than half had multiple wounds. Those he was able to treat seemed utterly insane. They kept shouting war cries and their eyes blazed, and strangest of all, they appeared indifferent to pain. This condition, which would later be recognized as severe combat stress reaction, reflected the extraordinary intensity of the Verdun fighting. The battle for Fort Douaumont became symbolic of the entire Verdun campaign. The massive fortress, with walls up to 8 feet thick and underground chambers that could shelter thousands of men, changed hands multiple times during the course of the battle. When the French recaptured it in October 1916, they found that the interior had been completely destroyed by explosions, fires, and gas attacks. The fort had become a tomb for hundreds of men from both sides. The logistical challenges of maintaining forces at Verdun were immense. The French supply line consisted of a single road that ran from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, quickly nicknamed La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Along this road, an endless procession of trucks carried supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the front, while ambulances and walking wounded traveled in the opposite direction. The road was under constant observation and periodic bombardment by German artillery, making every journey potentially fatal. General Philippe Pétain, who commanded the French defense of Verdun, implemented a rotation system that ensured no French division remained in the front lines long enough to be completely destroyed. This system, which became known as the Noria, after the chain of buckets used to draw water from wells, meant that most of the French army eventually served at Verdun. The battle became a national experience for France in a way that no other World War I engagement matched. The German strategy at Verdun influenced British planning for the Somme. As the French garrison at Verdun was bled white, French pressure for British action intensified. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, repeatedly urged his British allies to launch their planned offensive earlier than intended. The result was that the Battle of the Somme began on July 1, 1916, while Verdun was still raging. Pierre Minault, a French soldier who began keeping a diary on September 22, 1914, found himself at Verdun in 1916. His entries from the battle reflect the grinding, relentless nature of the fighting. The day before yesterday in the evening, my dysentery took a turn for the worse. It was extremely painful, and I decided to go see the captain. He received me very brutally, refused all my requests, and sent me away with an opium pill. Minault's account captures not just the physical suffering, but the breakdown of normal human relationships under extreme stress. The medical challenges at Verdun were particularly acute. The constant bombardment made it almost impossible to evacuate wounded men to hospitals behind the lines. Field hospitals operated in underground shelters, often little more than cellars or caves. When medical supplies ran short, operations were performed without anesthesia. The account of the French surgeon who reported amputations being performed on fully conscious patients, who then asked for cigarettes and news of the battle, reveals the extremes of human endurance reached at Verdun. The seasonal cycle at Verdun brought different challenges. Winter fighting meant that wounded men faced not only their injuries, but also exposure to freezing temperatures. Minault's diary records the particular misery of fighting in flooded trenches during autumn rains. This morning I went to see the Major A doctor. Diarrhea, what's that? Everybody has it. There is no bismuth in Maricourt, therefore he is going to give me opium, still more opium. The psychological warfare at Verdun was as systematic as the physical destruction. German artillery targeted not just military positions, but also the civilian areas of Verdun city. The cathedral, the town hall, and residential neighborhoods were systematically destroyed. The message was clear. This was not just a military campaign, but an attempt to break French national will. Yet French morale, while severely tested, never completely broke. The defense of Verdun became a source of national pride that sustained French resistance throughout the war. The phrase "ils n'y passeront pas," they shall not pass, became associated with the Verdun defense, though it was never actually spoken by General Pétain as popular legend claims. Nevertheless, it captured the French determination to hold the position regardless of cost. The connection between Verdun and the Somme became direct in July 1916, when the British offensive began. German forces that might have been used to continue the Verdun assault were instead diverted to meet the British attack. This strategic linkage meant that the suffering at both battles was interconnected. French casualties at Verdun made British casualties on the Somme strategically necessary. The final French counteroffensives at Verdun in October and December 1916 recaptured most of the ground lost during the German spring offensive. Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux were retaken, and the German lines were pushed back almost to their February starting positions. The cost, however, had been staggering. French casualties at Verdun totaled approximately 377,000, while German losses reached about 337,000. The battle had achieved its goal of bleeding France white, but it had also bled Germany white in the process. The landscape around Verdun remained scarred for decades after the war. The intensity of the bombardment had been so great that the earth was poisoned with metal and chemicals. Trees would not grow in many areas, and unexploded shells continued to kill farmers and children long after the armistice. The Zone Rouge, red zone, around Verdun was declared uninhabitable and remained off-limits to civilian settlement. The Battle of Verdun demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of attrition warfare. While it was possible to inflict enormous casualties on an enemy, it was also possible to suffer enormous casualties in return. The strategic question became whether either side could sustain such losses long enough to achieve decisive victory. As 1916 drew to a close, with both Verdun and the Somme ending in strategic stalemate, this question remained unanswered. As autumn settled over the Western Front in 1916, the character of warfare began to shift. The grand offensives of summer, the grinding agony of Verdun, and the costly assault on the Somme had shown what happened when immovable defenses resisted unstoppable attacks. Breakthrough had not come, yet both sides pressed on, determined to find resolution in the mud-soaked battlegrounds of northern France. New soldiers arrived from home, still fresh in their uniforms and spirits. Young men who had waited in training camps now walked newly torn paths between shattered trees and fields churned by shell fire. They didn't yet carry the 1,000-yard stare of battle veterans, but they would in time. Trench life was the great equalizer, stripping soldiers of titles and expectations, replacing them with routines of hardship, fatigue, and strange camaraderie. One of these young men was Arthur Roberts, an engineering apprentice from Glasgow. He was thoughtful, strong-willed, and eager to serve his part in something greater than himself. As he trained and waited to be called forward, his diary hinted at both anticipation and fear, the quiet dread of doing something you may not be able to return from, and the pride of standing side by side with others to do it anyway. Back at the front, the Somme offensive had moved into its next, slower phase. Gone was the illusion of rapid victory. In its place, determination, persistence, and an agony of inches. On the battlefield, little villages with unfamiliar names, Gueudecourt, Lesboeufs, Flers, Thiepval, were fought over fiercely, their ruins changing hands again and again. The British learned that the machine gun still ruled, even when new tactics and strange new weapons joined the fray. It was here in mid-September that the world saw the debut of a new kind of warfare, tanks. Large, lumbering steel beasts, the tanks arrived with bolts shaking and engines sputtering. Covered in camouflage nets and mud, they lurched forward, unstoppable to infantry but vulnerable to mechanical failure and heavy artillery. Many broke down before they reached enemy lines, but some kept moving, oblivious to gunfire, climbing craters and crushing barbed wire. German soldiers had no defense against them because they had no idea what they were. Panic spread at the sight of these iron beasts rolling through no man's land, spitting bullets from their sides and appearing impervious to pain. Yet for all their visual strength, the tanks achieved little in a tactical sense that September. Many stalled, some were hit. A miracle of machinery, yes, but one whose time had not quite arrived. As the rains of October deepened the trenches into rivers of sludge, soldiers found themselves sinking further, into mud, exhaustion, and routine. The trenches, already narrow and treacherous, became home to more than just soldiers. Rats, lice, and fleas made their dens there. Illnesses, too, became as common as rifles. Trench foot returned with a vengeance, each man fearing the numbing cold that might one day take a toe, a foot, or more. Still in between shellings and patrols, life continued. Soldiers swapped stories. They shared the last of their biscuits and carefully rationed cigarettes. Some sang low tunes passed down from home, and many wrote letters stitched with emotion, honesty, and a quiet longing for the soft things of life. Warm clothes, home cooking, a voice calling their name at the garden gate. In this strange season, where mud was medicine and mortar fire was normal, men found quiet acts of kindness. A corporal might lend dry socks to a comrade. A chaplain might hold the hand of a man who knew his wounds would not heal. A runner might risk being shot to deliver a message that saved dozens more. The war changed with the weather, yet always remained the same. Back in Britain, the war continued in quieter ways. Families opened telegrams with trembling hands. Churches lit quiet candles. Munitions factories in Glasgow, Manchester, and Birmingham worked through the night. The home front held its breath. Holidays passed with empty chairs at dinner tables, their place settings kept just as before. And still the mud thickened, the air grew colder. Only the wounded left the trenches by stretcher or by prayer. At night, in the lull between bombardments, the front might grow surprisingly peaceful. Fireflies danced near dugouts, exhausted men stared up at star-filled skies, and the low hoots of owls replaced the whistle of shells for a while. Letters from home were read by dim candlelight, treasured and reread until the paper wore thin. By November, the Somme offensive was nearing its end. The British line had moved forward ever so slightly, perhaps 6 or 7 miles total, but that gain had cost them over 400,000 casualties. The Germans had suffered nearly as much. What had been gained was, in a military sense, minimal. But for the soldiers who had endured it, what had been tested was the depth of a man's spirit and his willingness to trust the man beside him more than the safety that had long since disappeared. The Battle of the Somme, many later said, wasn't won or lost. It just was. And in that quiet reckoning, in the faces of the tired, the once hopeful, and the now hardened, history's true cost could be seen. In the months to come, the war would go on. Arthur Roberts would finally see his battlefields. Others would never leave the ones they now called home. The leaves, once green, now rotted in clumps at the trench base. And as the men wrapped themselves against another cold night, few could guess how long the war would last. But they endured inch by muddy inch, day by weary day, until spring came again or didn't. As early winter settled over the Western Front, flurries of wind carried more than cold. They spoke of endings, of plans unfinished, of soldiers unknowingly spending their final nights peering from fire steps into fog. It was November, and the Battle of the Somme was nearing its weary conclusion. What had begun with thunderous artillery and hopeful command had stretched into 141 days of rain, mud, and loss. The British army had advanced, yes, but only by a few difficult miles. From the chalky ridges above the Anchor through the smashed ruins of Thiepval and Guillemot, they had pushed and crawled and clung to every inch. And yet, so little ground had truly been gained. Among the ranks of weary survivors were men hardened by months of exposure, dulled by the ceaseless echo of shell bursts, and aged beyond their years. New uniforms had faded to dirt-soaked rags. Faces were no longer young, and dreams of home had long since been shelved away in favor of numb routine. Private Arthur Edward Diggins had been among them, a soldier with a quiet mind and a small pencil diary. His final entries, written in a careful, looping hand, stopped in early October. No explanation followed. Perhaps he'd simply lost his diary in the mud. Perhaps his hands became too numb to write. Or perhaps his story, like so many others, had ended on one of those gray mornings filled with shell fire and uncertainty. Elsewhere, regiments rotated back along broken roads to support lines or rest areas. Towns behind the front where ragged soldiers could scrub away layers of grit and exhaustion, shave under candlelight, and find, if only for a while, something close to quiet. In the cellars of ruined chapels and the barns of shattered farms, men found warmth from braziers and the soft rustle of letters from home. Meals, no longer cold and rushed, were eaten with slow satisfaction. A tin of sardines, a cube of sugar, a fresh pair of socks, small things became treasure. But even far from the line, the war lingered. Ambulances with canvas tops groaned under the weight of the wounded. Stretcher bearers moved like shadows. Shells could be heard in the distance, and the news from the front seeped into every conversation. For some men, the day the battle ended, November 18th, passed with little notice. The psalm didn't end with a trumpet or declaration. It faded into fog, wet snow, and silence. Orders stopped coming. The push was over. The tears and mud were not. In its wake, over 1 million casualties. British, French, German, dead, wounded, missing. Names written on field reports, headstones, and the corners of letters that never reached home. Yet in the small moments, dignity survived. Some men held their friends as the frost thickened on shell shards beside them. Some placed boots on the feet of those who would never stand again. A sergeant wrote to a widow by firelight, his thick fingers struggling to keep the tremble out of the ink. But the words, kind and careful, spoke volumes a uniform never could. Behind the lines, chaplains laid folded flags across stretchers, whispering prayers to the wind. Elsewhere, freshly dug graves were marked only with rifles stuck firmly in chalky soil, and a tin helmet perched gently on top, as if the man inside were only sleeping. Winter crept slowly across Picardy. The frozen churn of no man's land became harder to cross and harder still to bury. Bodies, now part of the land, lay wrapped in ice, their resting places marked by frost rather than flags. In Whitehall, war planners reviewed reports. Maps were pored over with red lines and quiet sighs. The Somme was declared a strategic necessity. It had, they argued, weakened the German lines. It had tested new weapons. It had prepared the army for even greater things to come. But few who had walked those trenches believed such words could ever weigh fairly against what had been lost. By December, the snows began. There were no more major offensives. For a time, quiet returned, but whispers ran through the ranks. Next spring, they said, they're planning again. In beds across England, mothers read and reread the official letters. Some had 5 lines, a few had 20, and nearly all ended the same way: "We regret to inform you," or "He served his country bravely." Still, the world moved forward quietly. Boots were repaired, trenches were deepened. New recruits arrived, wide-eyed and soft-spoken. And in far-off corners of rest billets, men like Arthur Roberts read by candlelight. For now, he had yet to see combat. But the wind at his window, the way the older men looked past him as they spoke, it all warned him of what the coming year might bring. The battle was over, yes. But the war had only paused to breathe. And across the fields of northern France, beneath that wide and winter-gray sky, December arrived, not as an end, but as a shadow stretching toward tomorrow. As the guns faded into history and silence returned to the fields, the world looked upon what remained. The war that had begun with so much ceremony and certainty ended not with parades, but with heavy hearts, letters folded away, and landscapes changed forever. In northern France, where the river Somme still winds through chalky farmland, the earth bears quiet scars. Hills that once echoed with cannon fire now host the songs of larks and the hum of wind through rusted barbed wire. Trees grow again where none stood, yet the bones of the past lie just beneath the surface. Even now, farmers turning soil uncover rusted helmets, shell casings, and bayonets lost a century before, ghosts of men once 20, sleeping where no one recorded their names. Somewhere in the soft valleys of Glasgow, Arthur Roberts lived out his years after the war. The engineering apprentice turned soldier returned to civilian life quietly. He married, worked, raised a family. He played the banjo in a British Legion dance band, and in moments between tunes sipped slowly from a cup of tea, remembering fields soaked in rain, comrades lost, and evenings when the sound of distant artillery was all that filled the sky. His diary survived, pages stained, edges torn, ink faded by time. Inside, his words breathed of fear, of pride, of hope held tightly in a pocket when all else had been stripped away. The names of villages, Thiepval, Delville Wood, Flers-Courcelette, once markers of daily advances and desperate retreats, now stand etched in white stone, watched over by flowers and silence. Neatly arranged graves stretch across the countryside, white markers lined like sentinels, each inscribed with a name, a rank, and sometimes a line, a son, a brother, forever remembered. And for many, no name was left, only the words, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. Back home, families rebuilt lives missing fathers, brothers, lovers. Photographs were framed and placed beside quiet mantles. Medals collected dust inside drawers that were opened only on stormy nights when one needed to remember what had come before. Some wounds healed, others lived silently beneath the surface. Years turned slowly. The young became old. Stories first told around dinner tables and passed in letters faded from everyday speech. But the war remained deep in the roots of nations, in quiet cemeteries and distant corners of family trees. And still the stories endure. Through diaries, through whispers, through rustling letters kept in biscuit tins in attics, and now through voices like this, spoken into quiet rooms as the world winds down for sleep. Because these were not just soldiers, they were men and women with voices, with thoughts, with fears. They felt the cold, saw the sunrise, wrote clumsy poems in margins, and asked repeatedly when they might finally come home. They smiled at jokes over tea, stared at moonlight through dugout doors, and above all, hoped. Hope to live, to return, to be remembered. And tonight, decades later, you have remembered. Through their stories softly told, their words gently retold, you've glimpsed a world both brutal and human, distant but eternal. As the Great War pressed on, another silent army moved tirelessly behind the trenches. Their uniforms were white or navy, their weapons were bandages and calm words, and their battlefields were hospitals, hulking shadehouse, repurposed schools, tented camps, places that smelled of carbolic and hope. These were the nurses, the orderlies, the volunteers whose hands shaped not tactics or victories, but survival, dignity, and peace in a world collapsing at its edges. Arrivals at Base Hospital number 16. In the autumn of 1917, a soft rain fell over the quiet fields of Le Tréport, a French coastal village groomed by wind and spray. Rows of long, low huts stood in military order, their windows dim with evening mist. Inside, dim lights flickered over rows of iron beds, each one a world, and each world inhabited by someone's father, son, or brother newly arrived from the front. Sister Margaret Hollies, a nurse from Manchester, moved quietly between the beds. Her feet ached, her hands carried the stiffness of endless washing, but her voice remained gentle and steady. Margaret remembered her first midnight at the hospital, the sudden rush of wounded from Passchendaele, mud frozen to their boots, eyes fogged with shock and fever. Beside her worked Nurse Jean Martin, raised among the vineyards outside Orleans. Jean spoke little English, but her hands soothed as well as any word. Together they cleaned wounds, sponged brows, and wrote letters home for men whose hands trembled too much to hold a pen. At night, when the moans quieted and the lanterns burnt low, Margaret sometimes sat beside the open door, sipping weak tea and listening to the distant sea. Sometimes she thought the sound was like the pain in the wards, a constant presence, rising and falling but never quite gone. Letters never posted. For many patients, it was the nurses who became family, reading aloud dog-eared letters, handing out small tins of jam, or pulling cherished photographs from beneath rough blankets. Private James Cartwright, lately of a London telegram office, was one of these. He'd arrived with a shrapnel wound and a fractured spirit, barely speaking for a week. But Margaret, patient and unhurried, wrote notes home to his mother in neat, reassuring script. All is quiet tonight, Mother. The nurses are kind. They bring me tea with extra sugar and speak softly when I wake at night. Please don't worry more than you already have. I will write soon myself, I promise. Some letters were never sent. The nurses understood what messages could not be shared, the agony, the long waits for amputation, the uncertainty when fever refused to break. Instead, they wrote of comfort, hope, of birdsong outside the window and the kindness of those walking the night watches. The night of the ray. One November night, the stillness was broken by the rumble of distant guns. Enemy aircraft crossed the channel, dropping bombs on railheads and hospitals along the coast. The nurses, trained as they were in calm, gathered patients in corridors, laid mattresses across windows, and hummed low tunes to distract those nearest the glass. After the all-clear, Sister Margaret knelt by a cowering orderly, her own hands shaking now, and spoke a rhyme from childhood, a tune her mother sang when thunder rattled their modest home in Lancashire. She realized in that quiet moment that no uniform, however crisp, could hide the fact that all were frightened sometimes. Small triumphs and daily routines. With morning came routine, breakfast porridge, medicines, bandage changes, and endless paperwork. Sister Jean led a convalescent group intending a small flower bed behind the huts, pansies and violets, hardy and bright. Nurses and orderlies traded songs from home, laughter echoing briefly before a heavy silence would return. Some shifts ended with loss, eyes wet behind starched kerchiefs as they closed beds and whispered prayers. Other days, a patient would surprise everyone with strength, sitting up for the first time in weeks, or walking slowly to the sunlit porch despite pain. The nurses measured their victories in inches and hours, not battles won or land reclaimed. A fever breaking at midnight, a letter received, a face, quiet in sleep, no longer lined with agony. Home fronts and aftermath. News from beyond the hospital traveled slowly. Telegrams brought word of fresh offensives, but also of armistice hopes. Margaret dreamed often of her father's old garden, of cool rain on rose leaves, of the cats asleep on the hearth. Jean yearned for the winding Loire, her father's voice at supper, the scent of baking bread. When the war at last ended, some nurses returned home. Many found they could not forget. For years hence, loud sounds brought back the thunder of guns, and quiet nights reminded them of endless rounds beneath flickering lamps. Yet in their memories, the hospitals of the Great War remained places where kindness met courage, where hands stitched wounds as gently as they braided a child's hair, and where the best of humanity refused to yield, even when everything else seemed broken. And so, among quiet heroes, the war found its gentlest battlefields, where hope was nursed nightly, and compassion fought despair with every whispered lullaby and every light left burning in the darkness. The autumn rain fell steadily across the fields of northern France, each drop carrying with it the weight of distant homelands and forgotten monsoons. In a quiet sector near Neuve-Chapelle, where the trenches curved like a gentle question mark through what had once been farmland, Lance Naik Raman Singh of the 47th Sikhs sat beneath a tarpaulin, carefully cleaning his rifle while dictating a letter to his younger companion, Sepoy Govind Duz. The year was 1915, and the Indian Corps had been fighting on the Western Front for nearly 8 months, among the 1.3 million Indian soldiers who would serve in the Great War. Raman Singh represented thousands of men who had traveled farther from home than any generation before them. At 32, he was considered an elder among the sepoys. A steady presence who had served on the northwest frontier before this strange war had called them across the black waters to fight in a land where the very air smelled different. "Write this," Raman Singh said quietly to Govind, who held a pencil stub over a piece of paper he had carefully flattened against a wooden ammunition box. "To my respected father, Sardar Jaspir Singh of village Mehitpur, district Jalandhar, Punjab, I pray this letter finds you in good health and that the harvest has been kind to our fields." The ritual of letter writing had become sacred to the men of the Indian Corps. Unlike their British counterparts, many of the Indian soldiers were not literate in English, and even those who could read and write in their native languages often relied on the few educated men among them to help compose their thoughts for the long journey home. Govind Duz, barely 19 and the son of a schoolteacher from Mathura, had become the unofficial scribe for their section, his careful Devanagari script carrying the hopes and fears of a dozen men across continents. The letters that traveled between the Western Front and the villages of India told stories that official reports could never capture. They spoke of homesickness so profound it felt like a physical weight, of the strange foods that never quite satisfied, of the cold that penetrated deeper than any Himalayan winter they had known. But they also carried stories of friendship forged in unimaginable circumstances, of small acts of kindness that made the impossible bearable, and of a quiet pride in serving the empire that had given their grandfathers purpose and identity. "Tell him about the Sahib who brought us the wool socks," Raman Singh continued, his weathered hands moving methodically over the rifle's mechanism. "Lieutenant Morrison of the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment has shown us great kindness. When he learned that our feet were suffering from the cold, he wrote to his mother in England, and she sent a parcel with thick woolen socks for each man in our section. The Sahib distributed them himself. And when Naik Mohammed Akram tried to salute him with frozen fingers, the Lieutenant Sahib laughed and helped him put the socks on instead." The relationship between British officers and Indian troops had evolved in ways that surprised both sides. The rigid hierarchies of peacetime service had given way to a more complex understanding born of shared hardship. Lieutenant Morrison, a quiet man from Surrey who had studied agriculture before the war, had found himself responsible for men whose languages he did not speak and whose customs he barely understood, yet over months of shared danger, something deeper than mere military protocol had developed. Young Govind paused in his writing, looking up at his Lance Naik with questioning eyes. "Should I tell them about the Christmas truce by Sahib, about what we witnessed?" Raman Singh was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. The Christmas truce of 1914 had been one of the most extraordinary events any of them had witnessed, while the famous football matches between British and German soldiers have become legend. Few historians have recorded the quiet amazement of the Indian soldiers who watched their enemies emerge from the trenches to share cigarettes and chocolate, to show photographs of wives and children, to discover their common humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. "Yes," Raman Singh said finally, "but write it carefully. Tell them that on the day the Christians call Christmas, a strange peace fell over the battlefield. The German soldiers, our enemies, came out of their trenches carrying white flags. Our British officers were confused at first, but then they too climbed over the parapet. For one day, the guns fell silent, and men who had been trying to kill each other shared food and spoke of their homes. The Indian soldiers had remained largely in their trenches during the truce, uncertain of the customs and concerned about military protocol. But they had watched with fascination as their officers exchanged gifts with men they had been fighting the day before. Some of the sepoys had been disturbed by this apparent brotherhood with the enemy, while others found it profoundly moving. It challenged their understanding of warfare, which in their experience had been more personal, more clearly defined by tribe and territory. Write also, Raman Singh continued, that Havildar Tej Singh received a letter from his son. The boy has passed his matriculation examination and wishes to become a teacher like his grandfather. Tell your grandfather this news will make him proud. The news from home was a lifeline that sustained them through the endless monotony of trench warfare. Letters took weeks to travel between India and France, and by the time news arrived, seasons had changed and the context that made the information relevant had often shifted. Yet these delayed glimpses of home life remained precious beyond measure. The seasonal festivals, the monsoon rains, the harvest reports. The births and deaths and marriages, all of it helped maintain the connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. As winter settled over the Western Front, the Indian Corps faced challenges that went beyond the tactical demands of warfare. The cold was unlike anything most of them had experienced. Men from the plains of Punjab and the hills of Nepal found themselves fighting in conditions that seemed designed to test their very survival. The food, prepared by British cooks who had no understanding of dietary restrictions or religious requirements, often left the soldiers hungry and unsatisfied. The chaplains who offered comfort spoke of a God they did not recognize, in languages that carried no warmth from childhood prayers. Yet they endured, finding strength in their own traditions and in the unexpected friendships that warfare created. In the quiet hours between bombardments, Sikh and Hindu soldiers would gather to sing the hymns of their faith, their voices carrying across the cratered landscape with a beauty that sometimes moved even the most hardened British veterans to tears. Muslim soldiers would find ways to observe their prayers despite the chaos around them, creating small islands of spiritual peace in the midst of industrial violence. The medical care available to wounded Indian soldiers had become a particular source of concern for military authorities. Language barriers made it difficult for British medical officers to understand the symptoms and needs of their Indian patients. Cultural differences around pain expression, dietary requirements, and religious practices often led to misunderstandings that complicated treatment. Some hospitals began employing Indian medical assistants and interpreters, creating a more effective system of care that also provided comfort to soldiers far from home. Private medical letters from Indian soldiers often revealed the psychological toll of their service more clearly than official reports. The accounts speak of homesickness so intense it felt like a physical illness, of dreams that transported them back to village squares and family courtyards, of the struggle to maintain religious observances in an environment that seemed hostile to their faith. Yet these same letters also reveal remarkable resilience and adaptation. As men found ways to recreate elements of home life in the most unlikely circumstances. Tell them also about the garden, Raman Singh said, his voice growing softer as the afternoon light began to fade. Behind our rest billets, Sepoy Mangal Singh has created a small garden where he grows mustard greens and radishes. The seeds came in a package from his wife, hidden in the folds of a sari she sent for good luck. The vegetables remind us of home, and Mangal Singh shares them with all who wish to taste something familiar. These small acts of cultural preservation became increasingly important as the months stretched into years. Soldiers would carefully tend tiny plots of familiar vegetables, share spices that had been smuggled from home in medicine bottles, organize evening sessions where older men would tell the traditional stories that connected them to their ancestors. The British officers, initially concerned about these foreign practices, gradually came to understand their importance for maintaining morale and unit cohesion. The integration of Indian troops into the larger machinery of the Western Front had required adaptations on all sides. British signal operators learned enough Hindi and Punjabi to communicate basic tactical information. Indian cooks were eventually given some latitude to prepare food according to their own traditions. Religious festivals were acknowledged and, when possible, accommodated within the constraints of military necessity. As 1915 progressed toward its close, the Indian Corps had proven itself in battles whose names would be remembered long after the war ended. Neuve Chapelle, Aubers Ridge, Loos. The casualties had been heavy, and the tropical diseases that affected soldiers far from their native climate had taken their own toll. Yet morale remained surprisingly strong, sustained by the bonds of brotherhood that had developed among men who had traveled farther from home than any of their ancestors. The evening meal was distributed as Govind finished writing the letter, carefully folding it into an envelope that Raman Singh addressed in his own careful English script. The letter would join hundreds of others in the mail bag that would begin its long journey to India the following morning, carrying with it the thoughts and love of men who had found themselves part of a conflict larger than anything their grandfathers could have imagined. In the growing darkness, other voices could be heard throughout the trenches, men speaking softly in Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, and a dozen other languages of the subcontinent. Their words blended with the evening sounds of the front, the distant rumble of artillery, the scurrying of rats through the communication trenches, the quiet conversations of British soldiers writing their own letters home. It was a mixture of sounds that captured something essential about the Great War, its international character, its vast scale, and its fundamental impact on ordinary people who had been swept up in events beyond their control or understanding. Lance-Naik Raman Singh leaned back against the trench wall, his rifle clean and ready for the night watch ahead. Around him, his men settled into the routine of another evening on the Western Front, sustained by the knowledge that their words would soon be traveling homeward, carrying with them the assurance that they had not been forgotten, and that they had not forgotten the villages and families that had shaped their hearts in these small acts of connection across vast distances. The true courage of the Indian Corps revealed itself not only in their willingness to fight, but in their determination to remain human in circumstances that challenged the very foundations of humanity itself. The monsoon rains that would fall on Punjab that year would nourish the same fields that these men dreamed of as they kept their watch through another French night, proving that some connections transcend even the vast machinery of modern war. The morning mist clung to the pine forests of eastern France like the breath of sleeping giants, drifting through valleys that had witnessed centuries of conflict, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold in those final months of 1944. In a rest area near the small town of Septimes, far from the sounds of artillery that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Staff Sergeant Minoru Masuda of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team sat quietly beside his medical kit, writing another letter to his wife Hana. The autumn of 1944 had brought an unusual respite for the men of the 442nd. A brief interlude of half-day passes to Marseille and the chance to sleep without the constant thunder of guns. But Minoru knew, as they all knew, that this quiet could not last. Word had already come down through the ranks that they would soon be moving north, toward the Vosges Mountains, where German resistance had hardened into something approaching desperation. "My dearest Hana," he wrote in his careful script, the same handwriting that had filled prescription bottles back in Seattle before the war changed everything. "The weather has turned cold and rainy here in southern France, but we are well fed and our spirits remain strong. I think often of our little garden behind the house, and wonder if the cherry tree has lost its leaves yet. Do you remember how we used to rake them together each fall? And how you would laugh when I would accidentally rake them over your feet." The irony was not lost on any of them. Here they were, fighting for the country that had imprisoned their families, while their wives, parents, and children lived behind barbed wire in camps scattered across the American desert. Hana's letters came sporadically from the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho, each one carefully censored by authorities who seemed to find danger in the most innocent expressions of love and longing. Yet the men of the 442nd had volunteered for this. Nearly 14,000 Japanese Americans had answered the call when the War Department finally decided that their loyalty could be trusted, at least enough to let them carry rifles in Europe. They came from two very different worlds, the sugar plantations and beaches of Hawaii, where they had lived as American citizens without question, and the West Coast, where Executive Order 9066 had branded them as potential enemies in their own homeland. The Hawaiian Nisei, like Technical Sergeant Harry Sakato from Honolulu, brought with them a confidence born of never having their Americanness questioned. They spoke pidgin English mixed with Japanese phrases, played ukulele in the evenings, and approached the war with a gambling spirit that gave the unit its motto, "Go for broke." But the mainland soldiers, men like Minoru who had watched neighbors turn against them overnight, carried a different burden. They fought not just for victory, but for vindication. The train that had carried them from their rest billets to the Vosges Mountains was a study in contrasts. Hawaiian soldiers gambling with dice and singing island songs, while their mainland counterparts sat quietly, reading letters from families they might never see again. The boxcars rattled through the French countryside, past villages that had been liberated and others still bearing the scars of occupation, each mile taking them closer to a battle that would define not just their unit, but their place in American history. Private First Class Daniel Inao, a young man from Honolulu who would later serve in the United States Senate, remembered the strange mixture of fear and anticipation as they approached the front lines. "We knew we were good soldiers," he would later recall, "but we also knew that we were carrying more than just our own lives into battle. We were carrying the honor of our families, the future of our people in America, and the hope that our sacrifice might somehow prove our worth as citizens." The 442nd had already proven themselves in Italy, where they had fought their way up the Boot through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, at Monte Cassino, at the Gothic line, in the hills above Rome. They had earned a reputation for courage that even their white officers found remarkable, but Italy had been preparation. The Vosges Mountains would be their masterpiece. On October 15, 1944, the regiment moved into position near the town of Briars, a small French community that had been occupied by German forces for 4 years. The trees were already turning with autumn colors, yellow and gold leaves that would soon be mixed with blood and mud as the battle commenced. Lieutenant Colonel James Hanley, one of the few white officers who had earned the complete trust of his Nisei soldiers, briefed his men on their objective with characteristic bluntness. "Gentlemen," he said, standing before maps that showed the German defensive positions carved into the mountainsides like fortress walls, "we're going to take this town, and then we're going to keep going until we reach the Rhine. The Germans have had 4 years to dig in here, and they're not planning to leave quietly, but neither are we." The attack began at dawn on October 16th, with the men of the 442nd moving through fog so thick they could barely see their own hands. Private Kazuo Masuda of F Company, a quiet young man from Fountain Valley, California, led his squad through the pine forest with the careful precision of a man who understood that every step might be his last. Behind him, his men moved like shadows, their equipment muffled, their breathing controlled, their hearts pounding with the rhythm of soldiers who had learned to trust each other more than they trusted fate. The German resistance was immediate and fierce. Machine gun nests hidden in the trees opened fire on the advancing Americans, while mortar rounds crashed through the canopy above, sending branches and shrapnel cascading down on men who pressed forward despite the deadly rain. Medic Minoru Masuda moved between the wounded with a calm efficiency that masked his own terror, bandaging wounds, administering morphine, whispering words of comfort in English and Japanese to men who were dying far from home. "I've seen 3 men die today," he wrote to Hana that evening. his hands still stained with blood despite repeated washing. Each one called for his mother as he passed, not in English but in Japanese. Even here, thousands of miles from the camps where our families wait, we remain who we are. I wonder sometimes if that is our strength or our weakness, this inability to completely become the Americans that others want us to be. The battle for Briars lasted 3 days, with the 442nd Fighting House to house through streets that had been turned into killing zones by German engineers. Every doorway concealed a potential ambush. Every cellar might hide a sniper. Every step forward was paid for with blood and courage. Technical Sergeant Harry Sakato distinguished himself by single-handedly attacking a German machine gun position that had pinned down his entire platoon. Charging across open ground while enemy bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, diving into the enemy position and eliminating the gun crew with hand grenades and his rifle. "I just got mad," Sakato would later say, with typical Hawaiian understatement. "My buddy got shot, and I figured somebody had to pay for that. I didn't think about being brave. I just thought about getting those sons of bitches who hurt my friend." When Briars finally fell, the 442nd had suffered heavy casualties, but had proven once again that no German position was too strong to be taken by men who fought with the fury of the dispossessed. The townspeople emerged from their cellars and hiding places, kissing the hands of their Japanese American liberators, offering wine and bread to men who looked nothing like the Americans they had expected but who had delivered them from 4 years of occupation. But there was no time to celebrate. Orders came down from 7th Army headquarters that the 442nd would continue the attack, pushing deeper into the Vosges toward the town of Bifontaine. The men were exhausted, their ranks thinned by casualties, their equipment running low, but they had learned in Italy that war does not pause for human limitations, and so they pressed on through forests that grew darker and more forbidding with each mile. It was during this advance that word came of a crisis developing to the north. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas National Guard unit that had been fighting alongside the 442nd, had pushed too far ahead of the main advance and become surrounded by German forces in the deep woods east of Bifontaine. 275 American soldiers, mostly young men from small Texas towns, were trapped behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue, except for the battle-weary Nisei, who had already given so much. Major General John Dahlquist, the commanding general of the 36th Infantry Division, made the decision to send the 442nd to attempt a rescue. It was a controversial choice. The Japanese-American unit had been fighting almost continuously for weeks, their strength reduced to less than half of their authorized numbers. Many officers questioned whether it was fair to ask these men to risk their lives for soldiers who, back home in Texas, might not have welcomed them as neighbors or friends. But the men of the 442nd did not hesitate when Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller briefed them on the mission, explaining that American soldiers were dying in the forest while German forces closed the trap around them. The response was immediate and unanimous. They would go, they would fight, they would bring their fellow Americans home, no matter the cost. The rescue operation began before dawn on October 27th, with companies from the 442nd moving through terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. Steep hills covered with dense forest, ravines that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, whether that alternated between freezing rain and snow, and German positions that had been prepared with Teutonic efficiency over many months of occupation. Private George Sakat, a young soldier from Colorado whose parents had lost their farm when they were sent to the internment camps, found himself leading a squad through woods so thick that noon felt like twilight. Around him, the sounds of battle seemed muffled by the trees. The crack of rifle fire, the whisper of bullets through pine needles, the distant explosions of artillery that shook snow from branches and sent it cascading down like frozen tears. Move up," whispered the sergeants, their voices barely audible above the wind. "Keep your intervals, watch for mines, keep moving forward." but moving forward through the Vosges in October 1944 meant crossing terrain that had been transformed into a nightmare landscape of barbed wire, hidden foxholes, and interlocking fields of fire that could cut down an entire company in seconds. The German defenders were not the demoralized conscripts that Allied forces had been encountering elsewhere in France. These were veteran mountain troops, men who had learned their trade in the Alps and the Caucasus, who understood how to use terrain as a weapon more deadly than any gun. They had positioned their machine guns to create crossfires that covered every possible approach, laid their minds in patterns that channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones, and prepared fallback positions that allowed them to trade space for American lives with cold mathematical precision. For 6 days and nights, the men of the 442nd pressed forward through hell. Each dawn brought new attacks against positions that seemed impregnable. Each sunset counted casualties that left companies with the strength of platoons, and platoons with the strength of squads. Medical personnel like Minoru Masuda worked around the clock, treating wounds that grew more serious as the fighting intensified, evacuating men who would never fight again, and somehow finding the strength to continue despite exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical. "I cannot describe what we have seen these past days," Minoru wrote to Hana in a letter he would never send. The words written on paper that was stained with blood and rain. Men who yesterday were laughing and sharing photographs of home are now silent forever, their voices added to the wind that moves through these dark trees. I begin to understand why the ancients believed that forests were haunted. Every shadow seems to hold a ghost. Every sound might be the whisper of the dead. The breakthrough came on October 30th, when elements of I&K companies of the 3rd Battalion finally managed to punch through the German lines in a desperate assault that cost them nearly everything they had. Private First Class Daniel Inau, advancing through enemy fire with his platoon, watched his men fall one by one until only a handful remained. Then, with the kind of decision that separates heroes from ordinary soldiers, he ordered a final charge that broke the German resistance and opened the path to the trapped Americans. Technical Sergeant Harry Sakato, already wounded twice in the fighting, found himself face to face with German soldiers in a hand-to-hand combat that lasted only seconds but felt like hours. When his rifle jammed, he used it as a club. When it broke, he fought with his bare hands in the kind of fury that comes from men who have been pushed beyond their limits and discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. When the smoke cleared and the surviving members of the 442nd finally reached the lost battalion, they found 211 American soldiers still alive out of the 275 who had been trapped. The Texans, exhausted, hungry, and grateful beyond words, stared in amazement at their rescuers. Many had never seen a Japanese American before, and they certainly had never expected to owe their lives to men whose families were imprisoned in their own country. "If it had not been for them, I would not be here today," said Private Jack Wilson of the 141st Infantry, a young man from Dallas who would carry the memory of his rescue for the rest of his life. The bonds formed in that dark forest, between Texas boys and Hawaiian islanders, between mainland Nisei and small-town Americans, transcended race and region in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war. But the cost of the rescue was staggering, even by the brutal standards of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Over 800 casualties in 5 days of fighting, companies reduced to squad strength, men who had survived Italy and southern France finally meeting their match in the pine forests of eastern France. Company I went into the rescue with 185 men. Only 8 came out unhurt. Company K engaged the enemy with 186 men. 169 were wounded or killed in the fighting that followed. The casualty reports that reached regimental headquarters told a story that numbers alone could never capture. Behind each statistic was a name, a face, a family waiting for news that might never come. Private Kazuo Masuda, the quiet young man from California who had written so lovingly about Rome and the Italian countryside, was killed on August 27th while leading a night patrol along the Arno River. his heroic actions. Crawling 200 yards under enemy fire to secure a mortar and ammunition, fighting alone for 12 hours against repeated German counterattacks, earned him a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross and the eternal gratitude of the men he saved. Staff Sergeant Minoru Masuda, the medic who had treated so many wounded, survived the war and returned to Seattle to find that his pharmacy had been sold and his home occupied by strangers. He spent years rebuilding his life, working to establish himself once again in a community that had turned its back on Japanese Americans during the war, but his letters to Hana, preserved by his family for decades after his death, remain as testimony to the human cost of the 442nd service and the quiet heroism of men who fought for a country that had imprisoned their families. The rescue of the Lost Battalion became legendary, not just for its military significance, but for what it represented about the complex nature of American identity during World War II. Here were men whose citizenship had been questioned, whose loyalty had been doubted, whose families had been stripped of their homes and businesses and confined behind barbed wire, sacrificing everything to save fellow Americans who might never have accepted them as neighbors in peacetime. The irony was not lost on the soldiers themselves, as they carried wounded Texans through the forest toward safety. Many reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought them to this moment. They were fighting for democracy while their own democratic rights had been suspended, proving their patriotism while their patriotism was still questioned, earning their place in American society with blood and sacrifice while that society remained uncertain whether they belonged. General John Dahlquist, the commanding general who had ordered the rescue, later attempted to hold a parade review of the 442nd and became angry when so few soldiers appeared. He accused the Japanese Americans of not turning out for the required ceremony, unaware that their ranks had been so decimated by casualties that the survivors could barely fill a single company formation. When informed of the true reason for the small turnout, Dahlquist fell silent, perhaps finally understanding the true cost of the orders he had given. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would continue fighting until the end of the war, participating in the final push into Germany and the liberation of concentration camps that revealed the ultimate horror of Nazi ideology. They would earn more decorations than any other unit of their size in American military history: 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, and over 9,000 Purple Hearts. But perhaps their greatest achievement was proving that American courage comes in all colors, that loyalty cannot be measured by the shape of one's eyes or the place of one's birth, and that the true test of citizenship is not where you come from, but what you are willing to sacrifice for the country you call home. As 1944 turned to 1945 and the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the survivors of the 442nd began to think about home and what awaited them there. Some, like Daniel Inau, would return to pursue careers in politics and public service, using their wartime experience as a foundation for lives devoted to justice and equality. Others, like Harry Sakato, would return quietly to their communities, seeking only to rebuild their lives and provide for their families in a country that had finally, grudgingly, acknowledged their worth. Minoru Masuda returned to Seattle on New Year's Eve 1945, among the last of the original volunteers to leave Europe. His medical kit, battered by nearly 2 years of combat, contained not just bandages and morphine, but letters from Hana that had sustained him through the darkest days of the war. Their reunion at the train station, captured in a photograph that would hang in their living room for the rest of their lives, represented not just the end of their personal separation, but the beginning of a new chapter in the American story. The camps were closing, the barbed wire was coming down, and Japanese American families were beginning the long process of rebuilding their lives. It would not be easy. Property had been lost, businesses destroyed, communities scattered. The wounds of suspicion and betrayal would take generations to heal. but the sacrifice of the 442nd had changed something fundamental about how America saw its citizens of Japanese ancestry, and how those citizens saw themselves. In the years that followed, as the full story of the 442nd service became known, Americans began to understand that the rescue of the lost battalion represented something larger than a single military operation. It was a metaphor for the rescue of American ideals, a demonstration that the country's diversity was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. The young men who had charged through the forests of the Vosges, screaming Banzai, as they overwhelmed German positions, had proven that American warriors could draw strength from their ancestral traditions while fighting for their adopted homeland. The letters that Minoru Masuda wrote to his wife, like thousands of others that traveled between the battlefields of Europe and the internment camps of America, tell a story that transcends the purely military. They speak of love enduring across distance and suspicion, of families maintaining their bonds despite forced separation, of a people's determination to claim their place in a nation that had not always welcomed them. Today, when visitors walk through the American cemetery at Epinal, where many of the 442nd's fallen are buried, they find headstones that tell a uniquely American story. Names like Masuda and Sakato rest beside Smith and Johnson, united in death as they had been united in service. The white crosses and stars of David stand in perfect military formation, silent testimony to the truth that heroism knows no boundaries of race or religion. The forests of the Vosges have grown back, the shell holes have filled with earth and leaves, the barbed wire has rusted away. But the memory of what happened there in October 1944 remains, preserved in letters and diaries, in official histories and family stories, in the quiet pride of communities that sent their sons to prove their worth and watched them return as heroes. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team earned its place in history not just through courage and sacrifice, though they possessed both in abundance, but through their demonstration that America's strength lies in its ability to transform outsiders into citizens, immigrants into patriots, and differences into sources of unity. They went for broke in the forests of France, and in doing so, they helped their country find its soul. In the end, the story of the 442nd is not just a war story, but an American story. It reminds us that democracy is not a birthright, but an achievement, that citizenship is not a given, but a responsibility, and that the price of freedom is not paid once, but must be paid again and again by each generation that hopes to inherit it. The young men who wrote letters home from the Vosges Mountains, who dreamed of families they might never see again, who gave their lives for a country that had doubted their loyalty, understood this truth in ways that perhaps we are only beginning to appreciate. Their sacrifice echoes across the decades, a reminder that the America we love is not perfect, but it is perfectible, not complete, but always becoming, not defined by who we exclude, but by who we embrace. In the dark forests of eastern France, in the moment when Japanese American soldiers reached out to save their fellow Americans, the promise of America was fulfilled. And the true meaning of go for broke was revealed to be not just military courage, but the willingness to risk everything for the hope that tomorrow might be better than today. And so their story continues, in every act of courage that transcends division, in every moment when Americans choose unity over separation, in every quiet demonstration that we are stronger together than we could ever be apart. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team went for broke in the service of an ideal, and in doing so, they helped ensure that the ideal would survive to inspire future generations of Americans who would face their own tests of courage and character. In the silence of the forest, where the wind still moves through ancient trees, their voices can still be heard, whispering across the years the simple truth that they died to preserve, that in America we are all Americans, and that is enough. The February dawn crept slowly over the docks of Hoboken, New Jersey, brushing the tall masts of transport ships with pale pink light. Along the wharf, the men of the 15th New York National Guard, An all-black regiment newly federalized as the 369th Infantry stood in greatcoats and campaign hats, waiting to board. Some were longshoremen from Harlem, others porters from Albany, farmers from upstate hamlets, jazz musicians, barbers, students, and mailroom clerks. The army called them colored troops. The newspapers called them simply the Harlem Men. Their white commander, Colonel William Hayward, paced the pier with quiet pride. He had promised these volunteers that they would see combat, no matter how many obstacles the War Department placed before a black regiment. Now, with the Statue of Liberty fading astern, he kept that promise. France lay weeks away across a restless Atlantic, but the men hummed snatches of ragtime and spirituals, steadying their hearts for whatever waited beyond the horizon. I, a different flag on the shoulder. By March 1918, the 369th had reached Saint-Nazaire and then the training grounds of Givry-en-Argonne. General Pershing's headquarters, reluctant to mix black and white American troops, loaned the regiment to the French 161st Division. Overnight, the New Yorkers exchanged their broad American helmets for the curving Adrian helmets of France. Springfield rifles gave way to Lebels. Rations became dark bread, cheese, and vin rouge. The men laughed that the only English spoken in camp was baseball slang and the word buddy. Private Nathaniel Sloan, a pianist who would one day help shape the sound of jazz, wrote home to 133rd Street, "Mother, they pin a little tricolor crest on our sleeves now. We fight for the same cause, only under a different flag on the shoulder." Aye, aye, first blood in Champagne. On the night of 14 May 1918, two sentries, Privates Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, took post at a forward listening position near the Aisne. Moonlight silvered the razor wire and the shredded stumps of fruit trees. At 2:30 a.m., a metal click betrayed German wire cutters. Moments later, flares hissed upward and shadows poured through the gap. Roberts fell under grenade fragments. Johnson stood alone. He fired his 3 remaining rifle rounds, hurled grenades until the supply box lay empty, then snatched up his bolo knife. Small and wiry at 5'4", he moved like a boxer, slashing, thrusting, dragging his wounded comrade from German hands. When the skirmish ebbed, Johnson had 21 wounds. The ground held at least 4 dead Germans and blood marks of many more. Word raced down French trenches, "C'est un vrai diable noir, un hell fighter." The nickname stuck. Johnson and Roberts became the first Americans of the war awarded the Croix de Guerre. Back in Harlem, the New York World hailed Johnson as Black Death, though the hero, recovering in a field hospital, asked only for a new pair of boots and a fountain pen to finish his letter home. Aye, 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 days that had no nights. Summer should have smelled of wheat and honeysuckle. Instead, the Champagne front reeked of cordite gas and churned chalk. The Hellfighters entered the line in July and remained there in one sector or another for 191 continuous days, longer than any other American regiment. They patched duckboards, hauled Chauchet magazines, whispered prayers in foxholes, and endured the belted roar of 77s. At dusk, Sergeant Dan Stormy, once a Pullman porter, led nightly patrols into no man's land, feeling the torn earth with outstretched fingertips. Corporal Herbert Taylor kept a battered cornet wrapped in oilcloth. On rare quiet evenings he played St. Louis blues under the stars, the blue notes drifting over shell craters while French poilus murmured, "Treize beau." Yet losses mounted. Gas clouds left men coughing blood. Shellfire toppled dugouts. Snipers found every careless silhouette against the sky. Chaplain Anderson filled pocket notebooks with the names of the fallen, promising to write each family. Ivy, the Meuse, are gone push. September brought orders to join a vast Allied offensive. At Ripon, the 369th surged through broken wire and zigzag trenches, seizing 6 field guns and dozens of prisoners. On 29 September, they attacked the ridge above Sechol. Machine gun fire scythed the forward companies, but the Hellfighters crawled, sprinted, and outflanked nests hidden among blasted oaks. By evening, the tricolor flag waved over the shattered village church. Captain Hamilton Fish, a white officer from an old New York family, counted barely 150 effectives left in his battalion. He watched stretcher teams carry away men who, only weeks earlier, had played stickball on Lenox Avenue. In his diary he wrote, "They have earned a place in history no bullet can destroy." V crossing the Rhine and coming home. When the armistice sounded on 11 November 1918, the Hellfighters were pushing toward the Rhine. In December, as part of the French Army of Occupation, they marched across the river near Mainz, first of all Allied units to set foot on German soil. Poppies still bloomed scarlet along the banks, nodding in the chill wind like blood-bright witnesses. The transport La France carried them back to New York in February 1919. Snow fell lightly on Fifth Avenue as 250,000 spectators jammed sidewalks and fire escapes. Women waved feathered hats, Pullman porters hoisted children onto shoulders. Down the avenue rolled drums, bugles, and the incomparable 369th Regimental Band under Lieutenant Jim Europe, blasting March of the Hellfighters, while horses shied and policemen grinned. Colonel Hayward rode at the head, hat in hand. Behind him strode veterans in horizon blue Adrian helmets, their battle flag heavy with 21 campaign streamers and a French Croix de Guerre ribbon. Many limped, some sleeves hung empty, yet they marched with heads high, for the city that once barred them from the Rainbow Division now roared its gratitude. VI epilogue in quiet tones. The years that followed were not always kind. Henry Johnson died penniless in 1929. Needham Roberts struggled with injuries and silence. Recognition lagged. The American military awarded Johnson a Purple Heart only in 1996, a Distinguished Service Cross in 2002, and at last the Medal of Honor in 2015. But stories whispered in Harlem barber chairs, in Alabama church basements, and on Louisiana porches kept faith alive until the nation caught up. Tonight, when you close your eyes, imagine a quiet trench lit by a single flare. See Johnson standing small but unyielding, bolo knife flashing. Hear Jim Europe's jazz drifting over the broken vineyards. Picture a snowy Fifth Avenue where exhausted soldiers lift their chins at the thunder of cheers. And remember that the Harlem Hellfighters, denied equality at home, proved on foreign fields that courage wears any skin, and freedom's song is richer for every voice that joins the chorus. May their long march lull you gently towards sleep, each footstep a steady drum beat, fading softly into the hush of distant fields where poppies still nod beneath a twilight sky.